the medium of what is present, experience itself, is the highest content, is the important fact, reveals what is actually happening here in the most profound way, that our interpretations of it just don't. They aren't comprehensive enough. So that's a little trick of how to do it. If people want spiritual practices. So it's very easy, very, very easy spiritual practice, and it's profoundly powerful, because it turns out that what is present as experience, these actual textures that we notice, are transcendental qualities. Light itself is an inconceivability. Light is an astounding, inconceivable, transcendental energy presence. I mean, these words are stupid, right? They don't make much sense. But they can't make sense because you can't say what it is. But just this simple, obvious present fact of the presence of light is revealing something absolutely inconceivable. And you can be with and notice and appreciate that inconceivability simply by, being present with the texture of light, or of any experience, the same thing. And it turns out that the substantial presence of any experience is ultimately the same stuff. So light is made of the same, the textural presence of light is made of the same thing as the textural presence of sound, is made of the same thing as the textural presence of thought, sensation, all of them. They're all what? We don't have a word for this. In different traditions, they have a lot of terminology for this. In India, it's called Shakti. It's transcendental energy. In China, they call it Qi. All of these words which basically sound very mysterious and spiritual and mystical, and these, subtle energies, and conjures up images of, I don't know what. But this is actually, all these refer to something which is very simple, very explicit and obvious and concretely present, namely, this that your experience is actually made of. Again, not as an abstraction, but this textural presence that is present as your experience. And it's completely accessible. In fact, you can't stop it. You can't stop the presence of light. You close your eyes and there's still light present, little sizzles. You can't stop sensation. You can't stop sound. You put in earplugs and you still hear the ringing in your ears or whatever. You can't stop this energy from showing up. But you can experience the energy as it is, divorced from this knee-jerk reaction to go to interpretation, to go to content of, what supposedly you're experiencing. And notice just that you're experiencing this textural presence of energy, and just doing that, you will discover what it is. Non-linearly, non-verbally, irrationally, but directly and intelligently.
What drives me crazy sometimes, or a lot of the times, is that I can get to a place where I can feel the texture of this, and everything seems sweet and right and whole. And yet at other times it doesn't seem that way, and I'm trying to find it. It's like I know it's right here. I look inside, somewhere in, through some sensation or sense, try to feel the texture of it, or I look outside to some object, beauty or something. I'm looking in both directions.
No. The texture is not beauty. The texture is not rightness. The texture is not sweetness. The texture is just light. Can light be ugly? Sure. Can it be unsettling? Sure. Can it be dizzying? Sure. Can it be unbalanced? Sure. It's simpler than you're making it. It's not about coming to some qualitative resolution. It's simply being with the actual texture of it. Like, what's the texture of water? Well, you put your finger in water and you know what the texture is. How can you verbalize it? You can't say. How can you put that into words? But it's completely obvious. Okay, so that's what the texture of water is. Now, what's the texture of light? You just look and see. This is the texture of light. Is it good? Is it bad? These questions have nothing to do with anything. So it's simpler than that. It's just going to the actual concrete presence of whatever it is. And it turns out not to be inert. I mean, this is the important point. It turns out not to be inert. It turns out to be a function of what we call consciousness. It turns out to be a function of what we call intelligence, and embodies and reflects these things. So light is not just light, like a stone is just a stone. Light is literally a living intelligence, you might say, which sounds very highfalutin and full of implications. But it's literally true, and not that you need to make anything of it. All you need to do is be with it as it is, and you will discover this. It's because it's not hidden. It's plainly to be seen. Like sound, what's the texture of sound? There's always sound, even if it's very, very quiet. Even if it's, just a little humming in the room or hissing in your ears or something. What is it? It's a sort of a present sizzling in your consciousness.
I guess another way to describe or to try to express what I'm trying to express is that there seems to be, it's like a different state, like a more of a solid state, a subject-object state, and then there's a kind of fluidity where things flow into each other. Mm-hmm. And as I'm kind of qualifying one as just more, there's more contentment in one than the other. Right. And when one isn't occurring, I'm trying to get there, right. And I can't, and I see that through looking at the texture of different impressions, sometimes I can get there, but, maybe right. It's not necessary to get there.
Right.
That's what I'm trying to express.
Okay. It's very important to not play one state off against another state. It's very important to not have this condition is here, this condition is here, this condition is better than this condition, so I'm trying to get from this condition to this condition. The flow is better than the subject-object rigidity, so I want to get there, and I'm trying to get there, and am I succeeding or failing? And you're just in this whole game structure. Because the thing is that the state of subject and object and the state of fluidity are actually the same state. They're made of the same thing. So when you're trying to get from one to the other, you're saying they're separate, which is going to cut you off from seeing what they really are. And by all means get from one to the other, but don't hold it that that's what you're trying to do. It's like you just go to it. Just go to the presence, go to the actual presence of experience, and you will be outside of space and time. You will just be in instantaneous presence, which is not qualifiable in terms of space or time, because So here's your field of vision, right? It seems to reveal a space, right? There's this space, this big room, and blah 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 blah. I'm here, you're there. All this stuff is in the field of vision. Okay, fine. What space is the field of vision in? Right now, your field of vision. Where is it? What's it in? What's it floating in? What's holding it up? It's right here. It's concretely present, right? Your field of vision is a very explicit thing. We're not talking about an abstraction here. This is something that is immediately and obviously present in your experience. So where is it? What space is it in? Where do your thoughts happen? What space is that in? And then the space that your thoughts happen in and the space that your field of vision is in, what's the relationship of those two spaces? How near or far are they from each other? And you look at things in this way and you discover right away, well, space doesn't really mean what I thought it does. Space within the context of a field of experience is categorizable, sort of relatively. I can say this is near and that's far. But when I look at the space that my field of vision is in and look at the space that my thoughts is in, are they near or far from each other? It's a meaningless question. Does my field of hearing, where is it in relation to my field of vision? What space are they happening in? Are they close to each other? Are they inside each other? Are they outside each other? Are they just completely different dimensions? And looking at this, we discover that immediately and readily accessible, experience works in a strange way. It doesn't correlate with our simple ideas of space and time and so on and so forth, and subject and object. So, you have like subject and object. So in the field of vision, there's subject and object. So I might say subject is over here, seeing object all out there, say, okay? But then, if I take my field of vision itself in the entirety as the object, where's the subject? And for that matter, where's the object? Where are these things? And again, it's not a matter of answering these questions. It's a matter of using these questions as a diving board to looking at your actual direct experience, non-verbally, not non-logically. Just be with what it is. That's what all of this sort of talking about being with the texture of experience. It's the same way. It's a trick to be directly with experience without holding it to be something, to be directly with experience non-conceptually. And it's a lot easier than it sounds. It's not like you need to join a Zen monastery for 12 years to do it. It's like, you want to know what water is? It's like, that's what water is. It takes no effort at all. It's just, there's the experiential, textural presence of water. It's completely irrational. It's not an idea. That's not an idea there. It's an actual presence, an actual textural presence. This light that's present in your field of vision is not an idea. It's an actual textural presence. So bang, you're outside of concepts. You're outside of definitions. You're outside of storylines. And you always are. Even if you have storylines about what you're seeing, the actual presence of your field of vision is not a story. It's not an idea. It's not a concept. It's a concrete textural presence within consciousness, let's say.
Excuse me. Earlier, when you were first talking about consciousness at the beginning today, I kind of, that's such a mystery almost all the time, but my mind was sort of in reverie state, and I got a thought that I'd never had before about consciousness, which was consciousness seems like the space between here and there. And it seemed like, in other words, this is what we call space around here all the time. I could sense its consciousness, and it had a certain sparkle to it that it doesn't usually have, or that I didn't notice as much as I did today. Sure. And also light going through it. It's like sort of perceive light, like in that light bulb up there or something. So when it hits objects, then that's how we can see them, is because of light arriving there. But it seemed something different there, and there was a sense of the sort of transition between things. That again, that space in there seemed to be what consciousness was, in a way that I never noticed before.
Sure. Yeah. It's good to look at these things. Be wary that what you're seeing is a final truth, but it's very good to see things in a fresh light to get a new insight on them. Consciousness has a texture.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Consciousness has a texture. Very strange. It's subtle, it's elusive, it's very strange, but it's not nothing.
The difference between consciousness and awareness, or is there any?
Yeah, consciousness begins with a C, awareness begins with an A.
Okay, meaning-wise.
Well, you're opening a can of worms there. I started off today's talk saying there's one fact. So if there's only one fact, then if there's any word that actually means anything, it must refer to that fact because there's nothing else for it to refer to. So if there is an actuality of consciousness, then it must be this one fact. If there is an actuality of awareness, it must be this one fact. If there is an actuality of being, it must be this one fact. If there is an actuality of the presence of radiant energy, it must be this one fact. If there is, and so on and so forth.
And
so
that was
again,
that was here-ness, right?
Sorry?
That one fact was here-ness. Or
can't be said what that one fact is. It's this. This is that.
Or
This is the
thisness.
fact. No, thisness is just a word. A fact is a fact. A fact is not a word. What is the one fact? What is the one thing that you can say that you know is absolute certainty?
this.
Sure. By which you mean what? What are you talking about?
What I can see and feel and sense. And
Yeah, the presence of your experience. The presence of your experience is an undeniable fact. And all so-called other facts are just aspects of that, right? Other people are present because they're here in your experience, apparently. Space is present because it's here in your experience. Time is present because it's here in your experience. So on and so forth. So there's this one fact, this right here, and all other so-called other facts are just little subcategories of this one fact. Presence of awareness, right here. Presence of consciousness, right here. Presence of a universe, right here. Presence of an individual, right here. Presence of transcendental consciousness, right here. All of these different words we have. We have been seduced into all this language, all this semantic logic. We're word junkies. We think that because there's a word for something, there must be a thing for it too. So there's 10,000 words, we think there must be 10,000 things. There's only one thing. There's only one actuality, one condition, which is this right here. And all the words refer to this. Where do you find cars? In this. Where do you find peace? In this. Where do you find war? In this. Where do you find hatred? In this. Where do you find love? In this. Where do you find 25-cent pieces? In this. All of these words we have and these ideas and these supposed conditions or objects are just pointing at little subcategories of this simple fact of your present experience. And it's not an idea, it's a fact. This is a fact. This is an actual fact. It's not a concept. It's not abstract. It's completely concrete. Remember when I was down on my knees whacking the floor? Where did that happen? In your experience.
Okay, the first one is the idea that field of vision takes place outside of the brain? Question. The brain being locally and is concrete.
Well, brains exist within the field of vision. Right. If you've ever seen a brain, you've seen a brain in the field of vision. So the field of vision exists, and brains exist within it. So how can the brain exist? How can the field of vision exist outside the brain? How can the brain exist outside a field of vision? The idea that the field of vision exists in the brain is theoretical. Field of vision exists in consciousness. That's empirical. Begging the question of exactly what consciousness is, or exactly what in means.
The next one is, it's said that objects are consciousness. Can you speak to this?
Well, the only way that objects exist is as objects of consciousness, hence calling them objects. So, without consciousness, there would be no objects. You know, if you were dead and you had never been born, how many objects of the world would there be? You know, you have to have objects, you have to be there. And then objects exist as an argument within your experience. You know, it's not that objects are consciousness or consciousness are objects. There's no such thing as objects distinct from consciousness. So having two words for it is just confusing. I mean, there's this right here. Where's objects? Where's consciousness? You know, can you meaningfully point to objects separate from consciousness or consciousness separate from objects right here? You know, it's just this. Is it objects? Well, sure, if you want to say so. Is it consciousness? Well, sure, if you want to say so. But it's just this. You know, we're in the habit of drawing all these distinctions as if they're meaningful, and then once we've drawn the distinctions, we ask questions about them. You know, but if you don't draw any distinctions, what would the question be? If there's just this, then what's the question in that context?
We have another question. A same person. That seems to relate to knowing objects, but not the identicality. Awareness does seem separate from objects.
I missed the last part of that?
Awareness does seem separate from objects.
If awareness is separate from objects, have you ever seen awareness when there's no objects? Try and find awareness where there's no objects. For that matter, try and find objects where there's no awareness. All you can find is this, because this is the only thing there is. And this always has some degree of apparent objectification. It always has some degree of apparent consciousness or awareness. So, on what meaningful basis can you separate them? Can you take the awareness and lift it out of a realm where there's any degree of objectification? Can you take objects and lift them out of a realm where there's any degree of awareness? They coexist. It's like up without down. You know, can you find up without down? It's like, okay, here's up and down, but are they the same thing? Up is up and down is down. Okay, fine. So, go find me an up without a down.
Another question. So if I was never born, then no objects would exist?
Right. except the possibility of you never being born is inconceivable because you never were born. Which is why there's always objectification. And let me elaborate. I'm not trying to be deliberately cryptic. It's that you were born is a story. You were told you were born. What do you know for sure? Do you remember your birth? Well, if you remember your birth, then you were there. Do you remember before your birth? If you remember before your birth, you were there and you weren't actually born. If you don't remember before your birth, you don't know you were born. All you know is that you don't remember it. But what do you know for a fact? You know presence of experience, which does not change over time. What it looks like changes absolutely, continually, but what it is doesn't change. It's always presence, it's always experience. And what is present experience is independent of what it looks like. In other words, you can be very, very sick. You can be in bed, with whatever. I mean, just some horrendous disease and feeling absolutely horrible and be full of drugs and all that. Just extreme conditions of experience. And yet, presence of experience hasn't changed. It's still you here, right? Experience here. Experience is not any less here when you're sick. Experience is not any more here when you're well. Experience is not any more here when you're happy. It's not any less here when you're unhappy. It's not even any less here when you're unconscious. Unconsciousness is a direct experience. When you're unconscious and you come out of it, you don't feel like you were newly created. There's continuity there because there's a sense of being, and that being is experience. That being is independent of what it looks like, and all appearance takes place within that being. The being is beyond space and time, so it can't be born and it can't die. And what appears is born and dies every instant. Every time you go to sleep, your entire world disappears. You die to it. You go into something else, and then you go into a dream, and you're born into the dream. It seems like something else, but the experience hasn't changed. It just looks different. When you're in a dream, you're not actually in the dream. The dream is in you. When you're in this life, you're not actually in this life. This life is in you. It's in your experience. And when you were born, that event happens within your experience. When you die, that event's going to happen within your experience. When you're on your deathbed, it's going to be you here, just like always, just like right now. And you're going to be, sick or in pain or drugged out or blissfully happy or bored or whatever it is you are. But it's going to be you here experiencing something. It's going to look like something. And, 2 minutes from the instant of your death, you're going to be here experiencing something. 5 seconds from the instant of your death, you're going to be here experiencing something. What exactly is going to happen 5 seconds after that? You're going to be here experiencing something. Death is going to be something that happens within your experience. So life doesn't make experience. Experience makes life. And experience, the reality of experience, which is the reality of being, is independent of what it looks like. When a dream is over, you don't die, you don't disappear. It just moves on to appearing differently.
Wow, good stuff. We have another question. we are part of a collective consciousness then?
I can only find one consciousness. Me. Nothing collective about it. Says you. No, if you exist, you are the sole inhabitant of your universe. You are the only consciousness that is in that universe, and that entire universe exists within your consciousness. You're essentially the God of that universe. You are the sole experiencer in that universe. You are the sole experiencer in your universe. You've never experienced another experiencer. You may experience a lot of shapes that claim they're experiencers, and they may or may not be, but not in your world. Right? You know, in your universe, you're the only one home.
Here's another question. Then there are multiple universes, or there is only one and I can disregard everyone else?
There's only one and there's no everyone else. When you go to sleep at night and dream, how many people are present? How many consciousnesses are present? And what exactly does disregard mean? You have an absolute intimate involvement with all of your experience and every aspect of it. So everything whatsoever that appears within your experience, apparently animate or apparently inanimate, you have a direct relationship with, an involvement with, a participation with, that has its own character and its own dynamism. None of it can be disregarded, because disregarding it doesn't change it, it doesn't make it go away. So the word, okay, I'm going to disregard you. Right, here I am disregarding you. You haven't gone anywhere though. So what exactly does disregard mean? You know, it's spin doctoring. It doesn't mean anything. You can't disregarding doesn't make energies disappear. So in other words, do apparent energies appear within experience unceasingly and with wild abandon? You can't regard them, you can't disregard them. They're there and you participate with them in the way that you do, which is all part of your intrinsic process. Just like in a dream. In a dream, energies appear with wild abandon, and you participate with them the way that you do as part of your process. You know, one person comes up and you hug them, another person comes up and you shoot them. You know, a monster comes up and you run away, or maybe the monster catches you and eats you in the dream, right? But it's just, what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's energies, apparently virtual energies appearing within experience and being interacted with those energies as you do. just like here. Why do you say what you say? Why do I say what I say? Why do I move my body the way I do? Why do you move your body the way you do? And it's just energies appearing, behaving according to their nature, and spontaneously interacting.
If I may poke at the dream analogy a little bit, just because if you poke at analogies enough and they keep working out, then they're probably onto something. I don't often have dreams where I can have a like-minded conversations with others in the dream that agree that they're dreaming the same dream.
Uh-huh.
So it's that it is your dream, but that shared level of experience with others within the dream don't follow usually standard dream.
Where do you find shared experience?
Within my experience.
Do you really? How do you know? What's your evidence for that? Like, let's say I say I'm seeing that video camera, and you say, yeah, I'm seeing that video camera too. So we're using the same words. We're using see video camera, and I'm using the same words, but that doesn't mean the experience is the same. In actual fact, the experience is arguably completely different. Assuming we both actually exist and are both actually experiencing, what you're experiencing is entirely different to what I'm experiencing, both specifically in terms of the photons that are hitting your eye, in terms of the angle, the shape it seems to be because of the angles we're observing it from, and I'm observing it within the context of my frame of reference, conceptually and historically, and within the context of who I am and what my life has been like, and likewise with you, which is entirely different, entirely unique. So we can say, yeah, we're seeing the same video camera, but that's just words. In actual fact, there's nothing about our experience of that so-called video camera that's the same.
I understand they're different, but there's commonality as well.
Is there? Give me an example.
From the different perspectives and the different experiences, there's still, the commonality is that there's a video camera there, or that there's some aspect of maybe different experience, but shared interpretation of that experience. But
again, the word that there's a video camera there, we might is a common, but the experience of what the video camera is, what there is different. Your there is different than my there. Your there is over here, my there is over here. In other words,
but we could shift.
Right.
We could do a space shift. I mean, that's not all the shifts that would be necessary.
But that doesn't make it the same.
Yeah.
It doesn't make. You can't make it the same. It can't be done, because you have your entire. You carry around your entire unit, your entire universe, your entire history, your entire perspective, your entire nature. That all experience exists for you in the context of, and likewise me, which every aspect of which is different. So even though, again, the way we would describe it, we might use the same words to describe it, but it doesn't mean we're describing the same event. Every aspect of your take on that experience is different than every aspect of my take on it, even if we would describe it in exactly the same words. Because words are generalizations, they're sloppy, they're not very precise. Whereas experience is extremely precise. Experience is you see yourself in a mirror, so you get up in the morning and see yourself in the mirror. You've never seen your face from exactly that angle and exactly that light before. And in the next instant it's gone forever because the light's shifted, your head has shifted, angles, you're a few nanometers away from where you were because everything's always moving, blah, 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 blah. So the actual precise reality of experience is absolutely unique to the observer. So and there's this claim of commonality. There's this claim of we're all in together. We all kind of see things the same way, but that breaks down pretty fast when you start to look at the extremes. So you get someone who is, say a hardcore, fanatical, Muslim, zealot. for example, who is colorblind and psychotic, and you sit them here, and you say, I'm seeing that camera, your experience is basically the same, right? You know, the context is so different that, you know, we can't know. I mean, it's the old basic thing. I look at the sky and say it's blue. You say, yeah, the sky's blue, but I don't know what you see as blue. I don't know. And that's not just sophistry, because people are colorblind. People see things differently. For example.
But if each universe is born in our experience, and only our experience, then dialogue becomes pointless.
No, it's not pointless at all. Dialogue is an unfoldment of your engagement with your experience, just like a dream. It's like saying a dream is pointless. A dream can be profoundly meaningful because you're engaging with your own energies, with your own meaningfulness, which is exactly what you're doing here, exactly what you're always doing. You're engaging with, sort of a technical way of putting it is you're always engaging with your karma. You're engaging with the energy patterns of your life, which may show up in terms of apparent other people, beings. It may show up in terms of the presence of inanimate objects. It may show up in terms of the presence of relatively subjective fantasies and thoughts, but it's all basically you experiencing energies that are meaningful to you as part of your own intrinsic process.
Well, then let me qualify that. Dialogue about the mechanics of the experience.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of that.
Dialogue about the mechanics of the experience, trying to analyze, interpret, understand, as if, using your dream analogy, as if you were in your dream trying to understand the dream state and not just dreaming, right? It would be a pointless exercise, I think, to try to investigate the mechanics of the dream state in a dream, right?
It might or might not be. You know, again, it depends on how you qualify that. Coming to lucid dreaming, which could be said to be penetrating the mechanics of a dream at a more profound level, can occur within a dream. And exactly how does it occur? It might be said to occur in some sense from some kind of examination, but it's hard to know. You know. But it is possible to be with your experience with different levels of profundity, and arguably, in my experience, coming to be with it with greater levels of profundity is valuable. And as nearly as I can see, experience itself is the process of coming to see itself at greater levels of profundity, which we experience not just in terms of sort of spiritual context, but we experience just in terms of maturing. You know, we're little kids, we're clueless, running around, being jerks pretty much, and we develop some subtlety and some sophistication and some nuance, and we get more subtle in the way we interact with the circumstances of our lives, and we get old, we may acquire a certain amount of wisdom and a certain amount of perspective and so on. So it's the natural trend of, consciousness, whatever, to learn to be with itself through the course of experience, more subtly, more intimately, more profoundly. And spirituality is just the let's say arguably the extreme of that tendency, of that process of, okay, if this consciousness can be with this expression more profoundly, and it tends to do that anyway, how far can that go? How profoundly can this be with this? And that's really the fundamental spiritual issue, is looking at that process and seeing if what's up with it, and if there's any way that it can be maximized or moved to its greatest benefit or whatever, right?
Thanks.
And it's not a matter of devaluing, others, people, or other consciousnesses, or that sort of thing. It's not a matter of devaluing them so much as of being really objectively clear about what the interaction actually consists of. And the interaction always consists of a presentation of, call it energy forms in your consciousness. and in actual fact, which is also the same way you interact with inanimate objects. So say you have something at home that you really value or that's meaningful to you, say you collect art or something, I don't know, and you have something that you think is just really great and it's meaningful to you and you're really glad it's in your life, and it is profoundly meaningful to you to interact with it, to experience it in different ways or whatever. How is, is that fundamentally different from a friend you like to hang out with? Maybe you don't talk to the painting in this case, and you talk to your friend, and you don't just sit and gaze at your friend, but you do at the painting, or whatever, right? It's a silly example. But it illustrates that fundamentally, at bare bones, interacting with another being is the same, ultimately, whether you think of it as animate or inanimate.
Paintings have lower expectations.
They don't talk back. They don't piss you off so much, usually. I've seen some paintings that piss me off, actually. So.
I've got like a gap in my head. How you said, you said me or mine, and I forget what it was about. It was like what's actually here, what consciousness is here, this, me. And so the paradox is kind of like, yeah, that's true. There is only me. Mm-hmm. And yet the experiences this me is having are different than the experience over there, just like with the camera. So the one fact then that you're pointing to is just that there's existence, or that it is, or there's some gap there between.
No,
apparently
you can't. You can argue that the experience here is different than the experience there, but you can't know it. The only thing you can know, so that the experience here is different than the experience there is not something you can know. It's a theory. It's a hypothesis.
Okay.
You can't even know if I exist. You can't even know if you're not dreaming right now. Suppose 5 minutes your alarm goes off, and all of a sudden you wake up and say, "God, I was dreaming. I was in Satsang. That was amazing." And if that happened and you woke up, you would realize I wasn't really here. In any objective sense, I was just appearing in your experience. And right now, I'm just, as far as you know, I'm just appearing in your experience. You can hypothesize that I'm really here. You can hypothesize I might actually be an experiencer too, like you are, but you can't know it for a fact, right? Yeah. Because the only thing you have direct access to is your own experience, your own consciousness. So, and when you say me, you're referring to that consciousness. When I say me, it's just an empty sound as far as you know. When you say me, you're referring to your consciousness, but as far as I know, it's just an empty sound, because there's only one me that I'm aware of, and it's not you.
So that's what I mean. So how is that one? How is that one fact?
It's not one, it's a fact. I am the one fact. I am that. You read the Vedas, it doesn't say you are that, it says I am that. I take my scriptures very literally. No, but not to be silly about it, but it's a strange fact that you alone exist. And that doesn't necessarily preclude the fact that it's a strange fact that I alone exist. And the fact that that makes no sense is why it's strange.
Yeah, that's the gap.
Whoever said reality is supposed to make sense? If you go looking very closely, you can't find any single aspect of it that does, so why assume that should? Yeah. So there's infinite uniquenesses, each of which alone exists. Very bizarre. Very, very bizarre. But this is a very bizarre condition. Everything about this condition is very bizarre. There's nothing about this condition which is not inconceivably bizarre. that there's consciousness at all. I mean, how weird is that? There's this mysterious power that unstoppably appears. They can see, they can experience. What's that? How does that work? Where's that coming from? What's that made of? I mean, it's inconceivably weird. And then not only is this weird, spontaneously appearing consciousness out of nowhere, but there's all this stuff appearing in it. What's up with that? It's not it's dizzying and stupefying. It's way too much of an understatement. I mean, it's totally insane. It's absolutely inconceivable. So the fact that I alone exist, and maybe you alone exist if you exist, and the fact that is not a contradiction, the fact that that's a weird statement is no weirder than any other statement in actuality. Because what's happening here is inconceivably weird in every aspect. It's not like it's weird in a few aspects and then everything else is sort of normal. Normal is just a euphemism for inconceivably weird. I mean, look at this bizarre world. Look at the world. You know what the world is? The world is a sphere floating in nothingness. This huge sphere floating in nothingness. Is that weird? I think that's fucking weird. I'm sorry, but I think that's weird. Okay, and there's all these other spheres sort of going around each other because of this thing called gravity. I think I never got out of the mental institution. I'm just way, way, way far gone and dreaming this whole thing up, What's the difference? What is the difference?
Thank you.
For what?
Just there's a quote. One of my favorite quotes keeps coming to mind is that from it's from Niels Bohr. The opposite of a correct answer is a wrong answer, but it may be that the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth. This little discussion made me think of that.
So I hope it's okay to resurrect a previous topic of discussion.
Anything.
Causality. So this experience, as I'm experiencing it, and all its vibrancy, through my interpretation of it, is a dependent chain of, well, it's not. I'm throwing. Now I'm going to throw time into it. Now I've kind of aborted one way of talking about it and forcing in a non-existent component. But so it's a serial dependent relationship. You said relationships don't exist, causality doesn't exist, time and space don't exist. So again, this is almost a pointless, articulation.
Just because I said that doesn't mean you can't say this. I mean,
well, no, I think you're onto something though. And it plays into that weirdness aspect that a billion chain of events, billions of chain of events, whether from a scientific standpoint, a personal standpoint, a serendipity, whatever you want to throw in there. But causality, there is something. Well, I just want to explore further the nature of what appears to be a dependent serial dependent serial relationship that creates a lot of the complexity that I'm experiencing at this point.
Right. Okay. There's some interesting ways of looking at that. There is an apparently intensely detailed interaction of forms with each other, let's say, which can be interpreted certainly as causality. There is degrees of apparent continuity which are very powerful. You're here, and you got here by being other places that are close to here, and then places that are less close, and so on. I mean, so if you look at forms as they change, there's a profound interconnection between apparent states that they seem to be in. In other words, it's not just totally random, where it's just random flashes of form, totally disconnected, like static on a TV set or something, right? So there is an intense patterning, and let's say patterning of forms, or interrelationship of forms as they change. And one conclusion or interpretation to draw from that is causality. Another aspect, though, that we don't often look at, particularly in terms of our interpretations, is that there's a corresponding degree of incoherence in the patterning as there is coherence. In other words, if you look at me, I look very precisely exactly the way I looked to you at the time. It's a technical communication. I look at, the sweater is right here, it's the shape it is, it's the color that it is, my face looks the way it is, it's moving the way it does, blah, 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 right? So it's all there's a lot of specificity there, right? A lot of detail that has a degree of coherence. I don't just all of a sudden jump to some other, shape or turn into a cow or something, right? Whatever, generally. But
depends on the circumstances.
Yeah. And we notice this. We notice the specificity, so we're very good at doing that. But there's also present an equal amount of unspecificity that we're usually less good, less focused on noticing, which is the fuzziness, the indeterminacy. So, in other words, anything you see of me, you see the precision, the specificity of what's present, but simultaneously with what's present is a degree of indeterminacy, a degree of fuzziness, a degree of lack of focus. So as much as you can say specifically about the forms that present themselves and the way they change, there's actually, on a level of precision, an equal amount where you can't really say a lot about them. You can't say exactly what condition they're in or what state they are or exactly what they are, because there's an intrinsic fuzziness. I mean, in one sense, this exists really obviously on the level of sort of quantum mechanics and indeterminacy and all that stuff, but it exists specifically, and it's aspect of the same thing in terms of perceptual. So, in other words, when any experience you have is never precisely sharp, and in that unsharpness, there is an intrinsic unresolvedness. Well, it shows up as a kind of a fuzziness, typically. The point being that as much as you can know about the condition, the state, the condition of a situation at any instant, you also can't actually know what that state is, because there's also an indeterminacy always present. And this may sound kind of abstract, it's a little bit tied in with what we were talking about earlier, what I was talking about earlier, that you can't resolve exactly what anything is. Likewise, you can't resolve the exact condition or state that anything is in. And in terms of causality, to say, X leads to X causes Y, or the chain of X, Y, Z is a causal flow, let's say. You can only do that with authority if you know what X is, what Y is, and what Z is. And if you look very closely, you'll discover you can't really pin down exactly what X is. You can't really pin down exactly what Y is. It's like there's always a wild card or a random factor in any event. And again, not as an abstraction, but as the actuality of what is there to be experienced, that makes it, you can't really say in other words, you can't say what's happening, exactly what's happening at any given moment. The more generally you look at it, the more precise you can be. So I can say, I see you sitting over there. That's a very general statement, so it's very easy to say, okay, that's pretty darn true. But then I get down to exactly what do I mean by that? What do I mean by you? And I get in and I start getting very precise about my experience, and all of a sudden things start getting fuzzy and subtle and complex, and exactly what color is your face, exactly what this, exactly what that, and things start getting nebulous and cloudy. So I can't really, as a general statement, I can say, yeah, I see you there, but when I try and pin down exactly what I mean by that, the more precisely I try and pin it down, the less I'm going to succeed, and the more it's going to be a question mark. I'm not saying there's something over there. Seems to be, that's kind of U-shaped if I don't look too closely. But so since you can't say exactly what condition anything is in at any given time, and you can't, and of course you can't, that applies to its previous conditions or conditions of other things. So when you look at a causal chain, you can only say it in a very averaging sense. You can say it in a sense of, it generally seems that this chain of events is interrelated, maybe in a causal way, but you can't say that very authoritatively. You can't really pin it down. You can't be very specific, because you can't say exactly what's happening very specifically in any instant, in any context whatsoever.
But the inability to fundamentally nail down exactly what's happening at any given moment, to dissect it and to fully, interrogate it, that doesn't necessarily. Well, I don't know if there's a full connection between that, and maybe again I'm missing the point. But I'm I'm taking it more to a macro level. That the nature of causality more to macro level, just because I cannot fully interpret, understand, discuss, or translate the moment if I dissect it very closely, doesn't mean that causality in more of a macro sense isn't. Again, it's this whole idea of causality from a macro sense. Yeah. I don't want to necessarily take it to a scientific standpoint, but let's play, Big Bang, hydrogen, smaller, more complex atoms, molecules, life, planet, whatever. Right? So things are going somewhere. It appears on a macro level. And maybe let's talk about it from that macro level, not the moment of this experience, although the moment of this experience is embedded in that interpretation and understanding of this reality, right? It's all tied together, and there's different ways to kind of discuss it and dissect it. But that on that macro level, the causality from a macro level, again, from a scientific standpoint, from a person's kind of life standpoint, right? We're playing with now time, space, relationship, right? All these things that we're interpreting at this point through my experience, right? Playing into this experience, being the fundamental building blocks that make up this entire experience. I can't divorce out that causality from this, because the nature of underlying relationship, time, and space are playing out in this experience for me. So if all I have is this, which is this experience in my interpretation is based on this billion chain of events of relationship.
But you're holding that. You're holding that there is a relationship, you're holding that there is a causality, but it's actually just a hypothesis. It's an apparent causality, it's an apparent relationship, but, the point of all that stuff I was talking about a few minutes ago is that you can't verify that hypothesis. you can't verify the causality. You can't verify interrelationship. It's an apparent interrelationship. It looks like an interrelationship. It might well be an interrelationship, but you can't know that for sure because ultimately it's an interpretation, and when you get down to the facts, the actual facts of experience, you can't verify it because you can't verify, you can't get, as soon as you start getting precise, everything breaks down. And again, I don't mean to be abstract about this. There is obviously an astounding amount of apparent interrelationship in forms, and we all know about this with relationship and causality and history and blah, 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 blah. But again, the operative word is apparent, because when you go start looking closely, things start getting strange, things start getting uncertain in terms of pinning down exactly what they are. So you can't really verify whether that apparent relationship is the way you're taking it to be or not. You can't necessarily disprove it, but you can't prove it. So it's just a hypothesis that's out there along with everything else. I mean, you can have a really precise amount of causality, and then the alarm goes off and you wake up and you realize, oh, I was dreaming. And as soon as you realize you're dreaming, then you realize there's no causality, there was just apparent causality. In the dream you can get in the car and take your key out of the pocket and put it in and start the car, but the key doesn't do anything. So it's an apparent causality, and if you don't know you're dreaming, it's a perfectly viable hypothesis. But all you need is one factor, like, oh, by the way, this is a dream. And once the introduction of one factor that wasn't noticed or acknowledged or appreciated can completely upset the apple cart. And, so on circumstantial evidence, you can say there seems to be causality in a relationship and all this stuff. But, on circumstantial evidence, there seems to be a lot of things that you can find there's no evidence for when you start getting down to cases, which is exactly what we're talking about here. Experience seems as if, I'm a human being and I'm in this body and I'm in this vast space and I'm this and I'm that and the other. But that's very quickly challengeable on a very strong basis when you begin to look at what your experience actually consists of. And what I'm suggesting is causality is in a similar category. And again, it's not that it's not true, it's just that it's a weak hypothesis in the face of the actuality, the empirical actuality of experience.
Okay, here we go. Can there be loneliness if I only exist?
Loneliness is based on the possibility of missing something, of having something not present that you wish. And since you only exist, but you happen to be everything is present. There's nothing you're separated from. There's nothing you're cut off from. It's like, can you be alone? Can you be lonely in a dream? Well, you can dream you're lonely, but you're not separate from anything because there's nothing you're separate from. So loneliness is not aloneness. Loneliness is separation. And in actuality, there's nothing that exists that you're separate from because you are everything in your experience. You are alone, but you are not lonely. Because you're with everything. You're with everything and anything. Why don't we have a 10-minute break, and we can come back for our last little segment.
Latte. Have chai will travel. Easy. Yeah, it's easy. He's easy that way. So yeah, anytime.
Yeah, I've been trying to come to these for a while. This is hard for me.
Where do you live? Just. Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, you've got a full life, it makes it hard to go to them. I agree. But do you watch them on Justin when they're aired?
No, I didn't realize this was.
Oh.
Today is particularly difficult because she just got a new computer, and for some reason there was something, the system is so new, it was tweaking differently than the one she used to use, which worked really well with the camera. And so we haven't got an image where we are getting the chat room, which is okay. And the chat room is interesting. But when I'm out of town, I watch it. And sometimes I just put this on the big screen and I listen and I don't watch what's going on in the chat room. But sometimes people talking to each other. And as a moderator, I make it a point to ask people to put a cue before they want me to read a question. Otherwise, I won't even look. I look up to see if I see any cue at the right after a person's name. Because otherwise, it's just a lot of chatting and talking back and forth with each other. Should we start?
Just a cue, a question. It just means I have a the letter Q. It just means I have a question for Peter, like that, and then I ask it.
Should I stop?
No, I don't know.
I'll leave it on, okay? Since you're still watching it.
Yes,
and
please.
talking to them. I'll leave it on.
So you really can't pin anything to definitiveness. If you're talking about science, that's what's kind of interesting about quantum mechanics, right? Throws basically different
Susan really wants me to go to sleep with her.
Who? With her? Okay, what time do you think you'll be getting back to the house? Because if we're in bed, might not be any way to let you. Oh, you can come in the kitchen door. Because we leave that open for
I
Eurasia.
might not see you till lunch tomorrow.
Oh, okay.
I have no idea.
Oh, you coming to lunch tomorrow? I thought it was just going to be Peter and me and Jeff. I thought you were going to be busy. Tonight's your last night at our house, right? Weren't you going off somewhere? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, tonight was my last night.
Okay.
I don't know. I think maybe it's all night. So,
It's all night.
well,
Well,
was saying that Super Gray. Go for fun. You don't have to worry about it.
well, no, but the back door is open anyway. The only thing is once Eurasia and Peter and I leave the house will be locked and alarmed. You can't even use that hidden key.
Right.
So, unless you remember how to do the alarm and have the
I
numbers
used to
in.
do it, but I don't remember. I would
You don't remember? Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's 102. You walk in and it's 102, 3.
That's to leave, not to disarm it, but to arm it. The thing about tomorrow's lunch is that I want to keep it small. It's Jeff and Beth who are leaving town. Right, well, I talked about it with Peter. I don't remember talking about it with you. I did. I did. Peter might have said that to you. I don't remember doing it. I had that conversation. No, that's fine. If you happen to be free and you come over, that's fine. We'll be at Soul Food.
It's all right.
Did Jeff? We're leaving the very next day. We don't see them very often. And then I included John and Irma's way to describe things I can here, and I thought that would be good. And also, Jeff and Beth, they loaned Jeff and Beth their car. So leave couldn't do. And also, I think that the six of us get along really well. We converse really easily. But if you can be here too, that's fine. 7 is a good number.
Yes, will happen, right?
Oh, because you'll be going. Oh, I see. Of course, you're in our car, so you'd have to come back somehow.
Are they going up there?
In terms of where I am, I guess.
So how are they going
But I recently saw a documentary called Absolute
Is that going to be okay with Greg?
and it's about
I mean, has he asked Greg?
in the arts, Robert Wilson. I really never heard
No, I'm not figuring, I'm not trying to tell you whether or not to do that. I'm just thinking he must have already talked to Greg.
with was Einstein at the Beach,
And no car.
which is an opera
Yeah.
I associated with Philip Glass.
Yeah, I think it would be fun to do. Or you can't do that because if you do that, then you won't have a car to get back.
But anyway,
But she goes to work crack of dawn.
he's
No, you'd be better off
interesting
staying
guy.
with Jeff back.
Wonderful.
and I just kept thinking about how you talk because
Big deal. Do you have
he had a stutter
toothbrush
when he was
toothbrush and all that with
so
you?
that colored his perception of the
Then that's all you need.
very much
Well,
comes
it's
in
good.
with the idea
Let's talk to Jeff and make sure that
see. And so all his work is very
yes, she does. No,
It's
she doesn't work Monday morning, I don't think. I think
to
she
bring
works- oh, you're right. I think she works Tuesday, Monday, and she's off.
it was fascinating.
So she could maybe bring
Sounds great. I'll check it out. Thank you.
tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Else, what I didn't want lunch to become is a satsang.
Thank you. I just enjoyed it.
No, they're not. No. See, I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying to you. Today is his last day of satsang with the group. Tomorrow begins our time alone. And Jeff understands that. And when he asked me if he could meet with us, him and Beth, it was just him and me and Peter, just like when we went segwaying with them, just for fun, as social, as friends, not a satsang. I don't want, and I think John understands it. Otherwise, it becomes a spiritual question, and I might as well go home. I'm not there. Because everybody's focused on Peter, and I don't have any questions. So what's the point of me being there? I don't want it to be another satsang. It's his time with me alone. So you see what I'm saying? Now you understand? No, I think you didn't get it at first. And the Monday lunches usually are that, but not this week because it's a week off. You got it? Okay, great. Sometimes I don't seem to speak clearly, and so people don't misunderstand me, or they what you understand.
I thought small surgery talk
Right,
and they're going to do a small fun one with children.
right.
Where do you go with that? You guys going to come over and watch the Academy
Oh, you're here. Yeah. When is that?
next Sunday?
Next Sunday? Oh,
Sunday night.
I'll mention. Peter and I usually don't, but I think it would be fun. Oh my God, don't you look beautiful?
I sent you an email, but maybe you didn't.
Look at that.
Yeah, we're going to Shiva Rock.
Isn't that the thing you're doing too?
Yeah,
I think that the folks who were asking about sort of the collective consciousness were also
Down here to get back over
interested
there.
in
She
how
rode here with us.
yeah, and then you would drive up.
a consciousness could also sort of assume
Well, so I understand what
all
you're
these
saying.
other beings sort of at the
Yes,
same
it
time.
is. It is, but not casual as a group thing. Casual as in Peter and I and how we're
thought
interacting.
the thing that
But it's very restricted. So who we invited, not to
talk
people
about
say,
is
oh,
how
we're getting together. Why don't you come too?
one can have a
You knew that. Okay, so you did understand that.
of other things other than just simply of oneself.
So it was sort of like
It's funny. I have no memory of that.
Bring it up and we can talk about it.
Okay. Okay.
I may have misunderstood what you were talking about. No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. Well, that's the reason I wanted to have Jeff and Beth, because we don't get to see them very often. And Jeff is such a gas. And Beth is so sweet, And sometimes she doesn't come with him. So I like to have her. But definitely, if you're staying at their house, you're getting right back to Marin with them, then of course you're going to be there. I would just like to steer it away from spiritual questions to Peter the Guru and have it just be Peter the friend and Louis and whoever else is there. You know what I'm saying? Okay. Because I get tired of sometimes I get sort of tired of, because it's nice to have spiritual friends who are the same beings. The majority of people are just muggles. And it's easy to get slipped into the fantasy when you hang out with muggles all the time. But in order for us to have a nice fun we're doing social community, to pick from our spiritual friends. It's nice when it's just fun, like when Jeff and Beth and Peter and I were segueing. We just had a blast. It was very funny. We had fun and we talked about everything. And of course, every now and then we just spiritual comment and we all laugh and we move on, but it wasn't like questions addressed to Peter to answer as the authority. And so, and then he gets to be just a guy. He gets to be, yeah. And I don't communicate just like he does. No, that's what yesterday when I said something, I've been telling you that. He said, oh, I know, it's not that you didn't say it right. What I was trying to demonstrate is that Peter has a way in which he says this that I don't have that facility. And so, well, I don't. I notice that I have, my communication style is odd. It may be because it's a translation in my head from Spanish to English and I start word things funny. And I come with my cultural connotation to life. Yeah, no, I could tell you were having a hard week. No. Listen, and I was able to relate to that one day when I totally it was that one day when I totally, yes, exactly. And I thought, oh shit. Luckily for me, that's only lucky. It's kind of like, it's like being hit by a tsunami. When you swim your normal way, when you're hit by a tsunami, you have to just drown.
Yeah, so it's been really great.
Yeah. But I prefer not to.
So, and they are all big. We can do different partitions. We can have, and we can have two different areas. You know, I mean, different areas within that one room. Yeah. And anyway, so what I would do.
It's fun. And make sure you block off a couple of I have a presence that keeps probably more for us to be outside. So maybe go someplace with Josh. But then you come close to me and you see that I'm this intense devil thing, you know, that speaks in fourth tongue. So no, but I'm aware of that.
What are you going to do about this?
Describe this to people.
I mean, the regular.
No, I don't know how to do it. And also, everybody's head is such a mystery to me. Well,
This would be a regular lesson.
because you're like my sister. And Greg is like my little brother. Yeah. So, but I'm not good at describing this. It's not because I could feel. No, I don't like that. No.
Beautiful. I mean, it's nice actually.
And no. And most of all, because
September is actually when they have rain and heat.
And I thought, oh, I know where
So October
she's at more or less. I mean, first album,
And it's
my
never
first different. And I thought, oh yeah. And also, I am prone to panic, anxiety, depression.
Yeah, no, there'll be plenty. I mean, and this one is actually, well, there'll be a lot. There'll be. Some will have.
But when you're in it,
some rooms will have two beds in.
It has a tactile, a physical
some
sensation component.
Rooms might have
there is
3 or
something
4.
that happens.
And I'll figure out a rate to charge
just
less.
saying it, right? I mean, I feel it in my gut. I get indigestion, or I feel it in my stomach get tight, or I feel it in
I think
my
there's a
head,
30.
my jaw.
They're
You know,
gonna
you
wanna,
feel
I think
it.
they want to guarantee
It's a body thing. I can't sleep. My shoulders get tight. So there's that aspect, and then there's
a
also
little
the emotional aspect of it.
Yeah, and there might be other places. There's camping, I think. I think there
You
was.
just don't want to have existed. Period. You wish your parents never had you. You could still be an ethereal angel. Yeah. See, so that's what I mean. I can really relate. So to me, at some point, but you're a different person and come with a different history. Oh my God. No. That's right. And I sometimes can do men because I can. Are we back? We're back. We're starting. Ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Jew, we're broadcasting.
So we have about 45 minutes left. We've gone all over the place, various topics we've been touching on today. The one point I want to emphasize is that what your experience is astounding, and by being with it nakedly, by being with it outside the context of holding it to be what you usually hold it to be, you can discover this fact of its intrinsic astoundingness, which will be profoundly transformative and empowering. And everything we talk about today is just exploring aspects of that and what the implications are and what's involved and how to do it and so on and so forth. But it's really a very, very simple fact, is that what this is absolutely amazing, and it will more than reward a sincere investigation into what it is. So anything, we have about 45 minutes. If you have anything you'd like to bring up that we haven't touched on, or you want to go in greater depth into something we have, now would be the time. And of course, we can also just sit here and enjoy the luxurious texture of this astounding presence.
So it's interesting about focus. And the fact that reality attempts to provide focus, in an ongoing way, but that in fact nothing is ever in focus. And so I'm sort of struck by this sort of phenomenal expansion that continues to happen, and at the same time there's a sense of being contained. And there's no sense of contradiction between the two things. Right. And yet there never is a sense of resolution. And I notice my tendency to want to try to pin that down constantly and to come up with some sort of aha moment, when in fact it's just all of that all the time. Yes. In an overwhelming way. And it's like being, at the Niagara Falls or something, where there's just this like phenomenal amount of water just pouring over the all the time. So anyway. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very true. This is following up on some earlier conversations that were had in another place. We were talking about how within consciousness, there's a spontaneous tendency that shows up to focus, to light on something. And we notice this in all of our experience. In the field of vision, you have a tendency to be sort of looking at something or other, and your eye, your focus of awareness will typically sort of flit around unconsciously. And the same within the field of sound. You can be sitting in a crowded cafe with all sorts of sound going on, and your ears will move to, your sense of focus will move from one conversation to another, to the sound of a glass tinkling, to whatever, and so on. And this is a mechanism that spontaneously occurs within consciousness, and we're all, of course, very familiar with this. But it has some interesting aspects, one of which is that just because consciousness is more focused on one area of its field of experience doesn't mean the rest of it has gone away. Also, just because consciousness is focused on one area of its experience doesn't mean that that area that happens to be focused on is any more important than some areas that it's not focused on. This focusing echoes the tendency of consciousness to be looking at itself with an urge to get a handle on what's going on, to find some resolution. Like, what's this? Consciousness is constantly asking itself the implicit question, what is this? What is this? How does this work? What's going on here? What is this? And, mostly behind the scenes. And this is not a problem. This is just in the nature of consciousness. But, of course, a final answer is never forthcoming, because what this is not something that is resolvable. It is intrinsically unresolvable. And as this learns to be with itself more profoundly, of course, it begins to relax into that fact, begins to let go of the expectation of finding some kind of a precise and final resolution as to what anything is or how anything works, and becomes more mature in being more open-ended and gentle and easy with it as a fullness, as a presence, even if it doesn't come into sharp and final focus as to it's exactly this or that. And yet that tendency doesn't stop. It continually, spontaneously wants to look into itself and ask that question, what is this? Even when it begins to let go of that as an expectation of having an answer. And likewise, this tendency to focus, to alight the focus of awareness on specific focuses within the field of experience, doesn't stop even when consciousness awakens to the fact that the full field is all equally valuable, equally meaningful, and just because a particular area of consciousness happens to be in the center of focus doesn't actually make it any more important necessarily than some areas that don't happen to be. And all these activities happen intrinsically and spontaneously because of the nature of what this is and how it works, and it's doing what it does, which of course it cannot be made sense of or resolved or figured out in any way or stopped.
There does seem to be sometimes this sense of being held, which implies that there is something to be held in. I mean, I keep thinking of the image of the baby in the womb, that there is like a contained space, and there is some sense of being, held in something. Mm-hmm. And yet, if I look and see, then I can't actually find that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a fullness. There's a fullness, and any partiality is contained in the fullness. Any area of focus, no matter what its scale, is contained in the fullness of the field that it is in. So you are in your experience. Your experience is in your consciousness, so on and so forth, depending upon the layers of the onion, how you want to spin it. But you can never get to the edge of your experience. There's always more. It's infinite, it's endless, it's edgeless, it's undefined. Infinite means without ending. In, I guess, French, maybe, Latin, who knows?
Every language.
But, so any partiality is always contained in more than itself. So there's always a feeling of containment, of being contained in a greater fullness, because there's always a greater fullness, no matter where you are drawing the line in terms of what you are. Your body is contained in the environment. The environment is contained in your experience. Your experience is contained in consciousness, and so on. And the intuitive feeling tone of this, this greater containing largeness is one of being held, of being supported, of being nourished, of being included, because it is that.
So I think I heard you just say that our awareness will naturally just zero in on things.
Yeah, it has a tendency to come to focus of attention.
And when that happens, we're screening out a lot of other things.
Well, you may or may not be screening it out. There is an emphasis, a kind of a zooming in on whatever you happen to be focused on. Like if you look at my face, you can see the people sitting in this row over here at the same time while you're looking at my face, but they seem blurry and dimmer and not so sharp, whereas my face comes into focus and all of a sudden my face seems to be relevant. And likewise, when you're looking at my face, you'll look at my eye or my chin, and you'll glance at the flower, and the focus of attention spontaneously is mobile. It very rarely has any fixity to it. So I was talking about that phenomenon. And it seems as if there's a kind of a shutting down of what is not being focused on, but in actuality that's not true. There's a de-emphasizing of it in terms of how much attention is being given to it, but it doesn't actually go anywhere. It doesn't actually become any less. It may become less sharp perceptually, but when something becomes more sharp doesn't mean that the other thing, like for example, I look at your face, it's very sharp. I look over here at Dick's face, all of a sudden while I'm looking at his face, if I look at your face in the peripheral vision, I can see it, but it's very poorly defined and indistinct, right? And I look back and all of a sudden your face is sharp and Dick's face is indistinct. But it doesn't mean his face has actually become that. It doesn't mean his face is any more important when I happen to be looking at it than when I happen to be looking away from it. See what I mean? So the fact of this spontaneous mechanism of focusing tends to suggest a heightened importance. And we experience this phenomena in thought, particularly with our obsessive trains of thought. We're thinking about something and we think about it over and over and over and we obsess about it, and all of a sudden it seems really urgent. But it's not just because we're thinking about something, it's not necessarily any more important than something we're not thinking about. But again, this mechanism doesn't encourage that, or doesn't necessarily make obvious that fact. And so, from a point of view of inquiry, in our present context, I recommend noticing the field and noticing that even though particular points within the field are being singled out as your awareness, as your focus of attention, lights on it, the whole field is itself actual, meaningful, pregnant with information, content, meaning. And just because you don't happen to be focused on something doesn't make what you're not focused on less important, and more importantly, maybe doesn't make what you happen to be focusing on more important.
So I think you just showed me a subtle idea I still had, that I was doing that on purpose.
Yeah.
And that I needed to cut it out. Because it was drawing me away from what's real. But if I'm not doing that either, which is...
No,
then
it's spontaneous.
Yeah.
But the important point to notice is just because that mechanism is always in force doesn't mean that you're being cut off from anything. Mm-hmm. Just because there's a spontaneous tendency to focus on particular specialized areas within your experience doesn't mean you're being cut off from the fullness when that's happening. It may be being de-emphasized, but it's actually a continuum. In other words, when I'm looking at your face, I'm seeing a continuum of all the space out to my periphery, and it all is included. It's all right here. It's not like I see your face and then there's a mote or a vacuum and then there's everything else over here and it's nothing, right? It's not. It's a continuum.
Well, I've been, because we talk about dreaming a lot, I've been thinking about what's the difference between a dream and waking consciousness, and is there a difference, and what is it, and trying to sort of explore that. And then I saw a continuum. I don't know, this is just what I see, a continuum there of when I wake up and I look at my dream, it seems very shadowy. There's a quality of lack of light, like a gray kind of quality, and when I'm obsessing, then there's that same quality. but it's different because I'm awake. And then when I'm really on, then there's a lot more light, and it's like my eyes are really engaged more, I guess. Mm-hmm. So does that make any sense?
Sure. It's important to notice, or I should say it can be valuable to notice that it's easy to think of dreams as being shadowy and vague and nebulous when you remember them from the waking state. But when you're in a dream, it's not necessarily like that. So don't mistake the quality of memory of the dream for the quality of a dream. Dreams can be extremely vivid, extremely actual seeming, extremely present, exactly like waking life. Although, again, when you remember the dream from the waking condition after dreaming, it may seem to be vague and shadowy, but try and remember your breakfast for yesterday right now, and that'll probably seem vague and shadowy too. When you were eating it, it wasn't necessarily that way, was it?
That's a good idea. I'll try that.
Yeah.
See how much of it is just memory. Yeah, okay. I don't have any lucid dreams, so right when I wake up, I try to see what it was. But it always has that exact same kind of grayness to it. So I don't know.
Seemed like when you were just talking, I was going back to before when you were saying that there's kind of two kinds of consciousness. The one kind of conscious consciousness that we normally use, and a second, deeper, more pervasive kind of consciousness that's always there, no matter what. Uh-huh. It seemed like you were kind of talking right just a minute ago about consciousness A, if you will, as opposed to consciousness B, which is this all-pervasive consciousness. And I'd wonder if you would confirm, clarify, or...
You mean in terms of the focusing thing?
Yeah.
No. Well, first of all, there's not actually two kinds of consciousness. There is... Because again, that is a continuum. There's just consciousness. There's just awareness. There is a primal awareness, let's call it, the ground awareness, which is the existence of awareness itself. It's the awareness that experience itself appears in. And then there's what appears in experience, which can appear to be various different kinds of awareness. In other words, you can appear to be awake and focused and clear, and you just had a cup of coffee and you're raring to go. 100% awareness functional on it, or you can be like dead tired and you've had 3 beers and you just shot up some heroin and you're pretty out of it, and yet that sloppier kind of awareness is appearing in exactly the same ground awareness. So the ground state of awareness is awareness that does not come and go. It does not increase or decrease. It doesn't get clearer or less clear. There can seem to be conditions of awareness that seem to be more or less clear, more or less focused, more or less on, which actually consist of that same awareness, or let's say modulations of it. Who knows? You can't really deconstruct it. But they are not a separate thing from that ground awareness. They are aspects of it and appear within it. I hate to go back to the dream analogy because we've been doing that a lot today, and I don't want to be too annoying with that. But an example is you can dream you're really awake, or you can dream you're sick and drunk, and yet the dreaming is the same dreaming. It's the same clarity of dreaming, even if you're dreaming an unclear state. So the fundamental clarity, the primary clarity of dreaming can dream a clear state or dream an unclear state, but what's dreaming it is the same clarity of dreaming. So when you dream that you are unclear and confused, you're dreaming that from a point of view of the perfect clarity of dreaming. When you dream that you're really functional and on it and clear and bright and focused, you're dreaming that from the same clarity of dreaming. See what I mean? And likewise, in in the waking condition or in any condition, whatever quality, whatever state seems to be appearing, it's appearing within perfectly clear consciousness, or it wouldn't appear. And that perfectly clear consciousness is the ground state consciousness, which is always here. And that's relevant to notice because we're very used to noticing our awareness and our consciousness that comes and goes, that we're more or less consciously identifying with in our personality and our functioning and circumstances. And we're typically less used to noticing this ground conditioned consciousness, which is always present. It's objectively present. It's impersonal. It feels like being. It doesn't even feel like consciousness usually. It just feels like isness. And yet if you look at that isness means presence of experience, and presence of experience means presence of awareness. So I'm suggesting it's valuable to develop a sensitivity to, or a noticing of this ground condition of this ever-present clarity that all states appear in, even if they're unclear states, appear in this ever-present clarity. When you're feeling like crap and delirious, you know it with absolute clarity. When you're feeling clear and focused and functional, you know it with absolute clarity. So that primal clarity of of the presence of experience is well, it's primal. It's intrinsic in the nature of what this is, and so becoming sensitive to it is becoming sensitive to what this is in a very primal way, in a very fundamental way, which reveals a lot about it.
And then getting to that goes back to what you were saying before about not being too taut and not being too loose with your methodologies.
Yeah. Yeah, because if you're one or the other, you're liable to get carried away, either with your own obsessiveness or your own distraction and sloppiness. So the trick is to sort of find a way of being in between. I mean, and that's all tricks. I mean, that's all really sleight of hand. It's not a statement. It's not really a clear or even an accurate statement. It's more of a magic trick or a suggestion of. It's a useful lie.
Is that kind of what the Buddha was saying about the middle way, a little bit analogous to?
Yes.
Thanks.
Along the same lines, there seems to be another dimension of consciousness that relates to sort of evolution and development. So I think about children at around age 2 or 3 or so. You can show them a ball and screen on one side and red on the other side, and you show them that the ball has both those colors, and then you show them the red side and you say, what color do I see? And they say red. Because they don't have the empathy. They can only see from their own perspective. So, and then that seems to blossom. We become more empathetic. Well, first off, we become more empathetic, physically with the world. The world isn't, at least the child comes into the world thinking that everything is itself, which is probably a great thing. And then we institutionalize it and socialize it so that it begins to think that there are objects and those objects are permanent and so forth and so forth. Mm-hmm. So along with that, it seems to me that there are, and certainly beyond perhaps where we are today, most of us in the room, there are these more inclusive sort of states of consciousness that takes in more than just simply ourselves. And I'm thinking of the Nisargadatta, the way he talked about beings being light, and sort of, there's this light but in fact, it's like pinholes in a paper, and there's this great big light behind, and that all of us are sort of these pieces of light that come from the source. And I'm responding. I'm making these comments because I keep thinking about the question earlier about whether or not there was a collective consciousness. And so about these other more inclusive states of consciousness?
Well, going into that, the primary issue is what do we mean by inclusive? Inclusive of what? And what's being excluded?
When you say I am not that, you're excluding, and when you say I am that, then you're bringing into yourself. It seems to me.
Sure, but then that begs the question: what do we mean by that? Which is part of another way of talking about what do we mean by inclusive. Actual inclusiveness means the inclusiveness of what is actual, of what is real, of what is present. What is present is not more than this, but this is not what it seems. In other words, like you said, a consciousness that includes more than the personal. The personal does not actually exist. The personal is not a thing that has limit. The personal is a misinterpretation of actuality, which is inclusive. And yet that actuality is not inclusive in some overarching metaspatial way where it's including more. To go back to our trusty dream analogy again, the dreaming consciousness is inclusive. It includes all of reality that is present within the dream state. That doesn't mean that there are dreams that aren't being dreamt that it includes, that it's somehow seeing in some other space and time. It merely means that whatever is showing up for it is all that there is. There's a famous saying that the Buddha is omniscient, and that doesn't mean that the Buddha can tell you, can recite out of the phone books of every major city in the world and tell you exactly the name of the phone number of the 27th person on the 38th page of each phone book. That means that the Buddha knows all that is actual, all that is real, which happens to be right here, right now. So knowing everything, knowing inclusive consciousness, does not necessarily mean inclusive in the sense of magnifying or increasing spatial content or increasing informational content. It means getting to the core of what information is present. To get more concrete, the consciousness that is conscious of every single, of all, of the totality of your experience is an inclusive consciousness. And if there was anything outside of that experience, then it is aware of it. And if it's not aware of it, then it doesn't exist. It may exist as an idea inside. The idea that there's something outside your outside of what your consciousness is aware of, exists within your consciousness as an idea. It's very similarly to, again, the dreaming consciousness. Something that it's not happening to dream about doesn't exist in some sense. It doesn't exist at all because it's not being dreamt of. This gets down to the notion of objective conditions. The supposition that there's all these objective conditions out there, like a vast plane with all sorts of information on it, and consciousness is zoomed in on a small portion of it. The dream analogy shows us a different paradigm. There's no vast table of conditions, there's no conditions at all, and consciousness generates an apparent presentation of conditions by generating them. So it's not like if it's not being dreamt of, it's somehow not being included. It doesn't even exist. There's nothing there to include. And the fact is that the only thing we can find is experience. So the supposition that there are objective conditions, that there are things outside that experience, objective worlds, other beings, other universes, and whatever, I mean, it doesn't matter how you categorize that, is a supposition that you may hold in your experience. But since the only actuality is experience itself, then by definition, if it's not being experienced, it doesn't exist. Now, this may sound very strange because we're very deeply indoctrinated in all sorts of explicit and implicit notions of an objective world. And I'm not saying that an objective world doesn't exist. I'm saying that it's irrelevant whether it exists because we can't know if it does. All we can know is the bubble of our experience, which is everything. Empirically, it's everything. You know, and the idea that there's more is an idea that will exist within that bubble, but it's only an idea. And that's not to say that the consciousness that knows the bubble of your experience is in any way limited. You see, that's the supposition that my consciousness only knows my experience, so therefore it must be limited. You know, according to who? How big is your experience that you suppose it to be limited? How big is your experience that you suppose it to be small? How big is your experience that you suppose it to be a finite amount of information? The bubble of experience is literally infinite. It's infinite in terms of the information density. It's infinite in extent. And infinite doesn't necessarily mean big. It means you can't find an ending to it. You can't find a boundary. You can't find like those little M.C. Escher circles where the angels get smaller and smaller and smaller to the end. Of course, you can't draw them infinitely small, but you know, our consciousness can be a bubble and yet be infinite, have no end. You can't ever get to the end of it. But all of that is akin to philosophical speculation, like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Empirically, we have the fact that experience alone exists, as far as we know. Maybe there's an objective world, maybe there's other people, but we can't know, so what difference does it make? I mean, how is that relevant? You know, then we can just speculate. And on the other side of that examination, the fact that experience alone exists is enormously powerful, because all of a sudden we have complete, unlimited access to the totality. Because you are your experience, there's no portion of your experience that is cut off from you, that you don't have access to, that you're barred from, or that is not nakedly apparent. So this is an enormously powerful fact that enables you to penetrate to the core of what this is. And having done so, you can then see if you're dissatisfied and want more, want something else somewhere else, some greater overarching something. But if you found some overarching consciousness, you would have to become it, and so it would be you. And how do you know it isn't already you? If you see what I mean.